In the late 19th century, Britain produced 80% of the world's ships. 40% of these came from the northeast. But even by this period, Tyneside had a long maritime tradition, which predated the Roman invasion. In 1703, 600 colliers sailed between the Tyne and London, supplying 70% of London's coal, and by 1830 it had reached 96%. By 1894, Tyne Dock shipped 5.6 million tonnes of coal, the largest volume in the world. Tyneside shipbuilding, coal and heavy engineering peaked between the 1880s and the First World War. It went into a long, slow decline after this period. This exhibition celebrates the importance of shipbuilding and ship repair to the riverside communities of South Shields, Jarrow and Hebburn, where thousands were once employed in an industry for which the Tyne had a reputation of excellence the world over. Today, almost all the yards are long gone, many now the location of desirable riverside apartments, where an unrelenting cacophony of sounds once rang out, signifying the busyness of brawny gangs of workmen toiling night and day. Now there is serenity. From warships to colliers and tugboats, ocean liners, bulk carriers, ferries, oil tankers, tramp steamers, paddle steamers, lightships, drill ships and lifeboats. All these and many more besides were once built, reconditioned and converted in South Tyneside by generations of highly skilled workers. The army of workers included naval architects, draftsmen, tracers, riveters, welders, markers off, platers, corker burners, boiler makers, shipwrights, joiners, pattern makers, plumbers, electricians, fitters, turners, blacksmiths and riggers. From labourer through to shipyard managing director, all played an important part in an industry which in turn brought prosperity to a long list of external suppliers, contractors and small businesses. The yards were dangerous places to work, where serious injuries and fatalities were sadly once all too common. But shipyard workers stuck together, looked out for one another, and came together in times of need. South Tyneside's yards were likened to big families, where several generations of family members did often work side by side. Camaraderie and humour provided a welcome distraction from a working environment which was at times unpleasant and sometimes even deadly. I have selected 100 objects from the Pushing the Boat Out exhibition to show South Tyneside's rich maritime tradition over a period of nearly 300 years. Our first object is a watercolour by Bernard Hemy, entitled South Shields Waterfront, Below Low Top and Entrance to River Tyne. At the right is one of the earliest shipbuilding areas on the Tyne, used by the wooden shipbuilder Robert Wallace, and later by iron shipbuilder Thomas Marshall and Redhead and Softly. To the left is a Tyne foy boat and the stern of the Royal Naval Reserve training ship Castor. Our story begins in the days of sailing ships. The hero of this story is a gentleman by the name of Robert Wallace. Robert began building and repairing ships at South Shields in 1729, at a yard adjoining the Coble Landing in Pilot Street. He did so in defiance of Newcastle Corporation, who had long claimed control over the river, insisting that only free men of Newcastle were allowed to build ships on the River Tyne, and that no vessel should be constructed at Shields. When the corporation sent an alderman with a posse of officers to stop Robert Wallace, the Newcastle dignitary was treated to an involuntary bath in the river when his boat's gangplank was shoved off the landing. Wallace went on to win 2 legal actions brought against him by Newcastle Corporation, and in doing so he destroyed forever the veto so long imposed by Newcastle on shipbuilding at the mouth of the Tyne. By the mid-19th century, wood began to give way to iron and steel, and wind power was increasingly replaced by steam. This is the period when shipbuilding and ship repair on the Tyne really took off, and Tyneside's yards earned worldwide reputations for excellence. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution and the adoption of new materials and technologies in shipbuilding, the building of ships became a major industry, and Britain would become the world's shipbuilder. In 1892, Britain had over 80% of the world's shipbuilding market. The main reasons for this dominance were: first, Britain was the first nation to industrialise, so this gave it a technological advantage, allowing her to produce iron ships quickly and easily. Second, Britain had the largest empire in the world, so needed ships to supply it and ships to defend it. Thirdly, because of the empire and the need to defend it, the government was very supportive of the shipbuilding industry. Over the next century, all of these advantages would slowly disappear. On the 31st of December 1916, tragedy struck North and South Shields. That morning, 19 men and boys boarded the pilot cutter Protector, but not one soul would return. Protector sailed from the Tyne, and about a quarter of a mile south of the South Shields pier she approached the SS Mile End. The two vessels were almost side by side, when, all of a sudden, the Protector disappeared within a great cloud of smoke. It is said that the cause of the explosion was a floating mine, or that she might have been torpedoed. Ship modelling is a craft as old as shipbuilding itself, stretching back to ancient Egypt. These models would have served a practical purpose in assessing the viability of a new design, and it would also have had a decorative purpose in the boardroom of the ship owners. The craftsmanship which went into these models is astounding, and for many people they are the highlight of the exhibition. Watteau means take hold in an Aboriginal dialect. She was built in 1904 at the Stonekey shipyard of Joseph Eltringham and Co. at South Shields for the Adelaide Steam Company of Australia. In the First World War she was used as a minesweeper in the Mediterranean and in the towing of ammunition barges. She also saw service in the Second World War as a rescue tug. She was broken up in Australia in 1955. 44 patrol boats were built between 1915 and 1917 under the Emergency War Programme. The design was simple, so the boats could be built in shipyards, unused to building warships. 19 P-boats were built in the northeast, of which 3 were built in South Shields. They were the fastest ships ever built at Red Heads, capable of speeds in excess of 22 knots. HMS Kelly is one of South Tyneside's most famous warships. Built at Hawthorne Leslie's in Hebburn Shipyard in 1939, she suffered a turbulent start to her career, surviving damage from sea mines, a collision with HMS Gurkha, and in May 1940 attack from A-boats and bombers in the Battle of Norway. Her luck finally ran out in 1941 when she was sunk in the Mediterranean during the evacuation of Crete. The story of HMS Kelly was the inspiration behind the 1942 film In Which We Serve, starring Noel Coward and John Mills. Stuart Milligan built this model while working as a pipe fitter on an oil rig. This ship's bell is the last surviving part of HMS Kelly, one of South Tyneside's most famous warships. HMS Transport Ferry number 3016, built at Hawthorne Leslie's in Hebburn in 1945. She could carry between 18 and 30 tanks, depending on their size. She could also carry a landing craft, as seen on the deck. In 1947, she was renamed HMS Dieppe. She continued as a roll-on roll-off ferry until 1967. SS Langley-Brook was a cargo ship built in Palmer's Hebburn shipyard in 1930 for the Medemsley Steam Shipping Company. She was one of the last ships to be built by Palmer's at Hebburn. Langley-Brook had a long career and saw her tramping away across the world, firstly under local ownership. Then she ended her days as Izan Maru in 1963. SS Homecliffe was a cargo ship built by Redheads in 1920 for the Cliff Steamship Company, a Redhead family-owned shipping company. The company was perhaps named after John Redhead's house, Rockcliffe, in Westow Village. In 1944 she came to an unusual end, being one of 55 old merchant ships sunk in June 1944 to form the Gooseberry Breakwater, which protected the Mulberry harbours constructed after the D-Day landings. MV Camellia was a bulk carrier built by Redheads for the Stag Lines Shipping Company of North Shields in 1953. Camellia was chartered to load grain and worked on the St. Lawrence Seaway from 1959. In 1977, Camellia returned to the northeast for the last time, when she was broken up at Blythe. Eppleton Hall was built in 1914 by Heppel and Company of South Shields. She was designed to tow sea-going colliers from the sea to Wharfside, a distance of maybe 10 miles. She worked as a tug for over 50 years until 1967, when she was then sold for scrap. Scott Newell acquired the tug and had her rebuilt at Bilkey. In September 1969, she then made a truly epic 6 months journey from the River Tyne to San Francisco, a distance of over 10,000 miles. Scott Newell wrote a book about her incredible journey. To my mind, there is no finer example of Geordie craftsmanship than the little Eppleton Hall. She is now resting at San Francisco Museum Park. SS Armanistan was a cargo ship built by John Redhead and Sons Limited for Strickline in 1937. Strick was one of Redhead's most valued customers, with a total of 40 ships built in just 44 years, the last being Nigeristan in 1970. Strickline ships generally had names ending in Istan, which were place names in Persia and the surrounding Arab countries. As such, stevedores who loaded and unloaded ships knew Strick's vessels as the stand-boats. The liquefied gas carrier Wiltshire was built at Hawthorne Leslie's in Hebburn in 1968. Wiltshire was built for Bibby Brothers of Liverpool. This painting was commissioned by Robin Gray, who was the shipbuilding director at Hawthorne Leslie's. The artist, Dennis Brown, was a naval architect at the Hebburn Shipbuilding Yard. This print is after a 1962 painting by Lawrence Stephen Lowry, the Lancashire artist famous for his matchstick men. In the last 15 years of his life, Lowry was a frequent visitor to the northeast, often staying at Seaburn. Lowry said, "I'm particular fond of watching large ships coming into harbour, or being brought down the river by tugs. I love the Tyne for that reason. It's a wonderful river." Lowry would spend a great deal of time watching the river from vantage points such as Mill Dam and the River Drive Bridge, where he'd go at night as well as by day. This work is a composite view across the Tyne, suggesting just how busy the river was at this time. Here we have a list of the 144 shipyard companies which have been in South Tyneside over a period of nearly 300 years. I nearly missed this hidden gem, but what caught my eye was the title, South Shields Kraftwerk. What? Kraftwerk, these are one of my favourite bands, and it is also German for power station. On closer inspection all was revealed. This was a 1940 Luftwaffe bombing map of Tyneside. Such was the importance of shipbuilding that most of the Nazi targets were shipyards. The targets included Brigham and Cowan, Tyne Dock Engineering, Middle Docks and Redheads, the Kraftwerk power station at West Holborn, and the gasometer, which has sadly been demolished at the moment. Thomas Brigham and Malcolm Cowan founded an engineering works on River Street, Costerfine Town, South Shields, in about 1874. They later moved in 1900 to Wapping Street, South Shields. During the Second World War, Brigham and Cowan were kept busy repairing ships for the war effort, but the location of the yard at the mouth of the river made it particularly vulnerable to enemy attack. Severe damage was caused by several bombing raids, mainly in 1941. Brigham's closed in 1982. Here we see the building of Brigham and Cowan's 715-foot long Big Dock, or Dock Number 1 as it was officially christened in 1956. Part of the site is now called Captain's Wharf and is today home to artist Irene Brown's fleet of 7 stainless steel collier brigs, which were installed in 2004. Tyne Dock Engineering was established in about 1880 at River Street, close to Tyne Dock. By 1885 the works had moved east to the Market Dock, just to the right of the present-day ferry landing. The yard was generally known by its initials as TDE, or as the Market Dock. In March 1980, TDE went into receivership. It reopened again, then closed for good in 1993, when the site was redeveloped for housing. Middle Docks in South Shields is first mentioned in 1772. It was situated to the left of the mill dam in East Holborn. It was a ship repair and ship conversion yard. The subject here is the conversion of the bulk carrier Dalkeith into a drill ship in 1976. A mobile crane is lifting a unit onto the drill deck. Lights, camera, action! In July 1995, Number 4 Dock at Middle Docks was used to film a scene for the TV miniseries The Tide of Life, based on one of Catherine Cookson's novels. In this image, TD employee Peter Burnett is kitted out in period costume as an extra. The yard closed in 1999 and the site is currently being prepared for housing. Redheads was established at the Lower South Shields in 1865. Then they moved to West Docks off Commercial Road. Redheads built an astonishing 645 ships. The last ship was built in 1976. The site later became McNulty Marine and is now part of the Port of Tyne complex. Some of my relatives worked at Redheads. John Redhead, founder of Redhead Shipyard, was twice Mayor of South Shields, serving for 2 consecutive terms, from 1878 to 1880. He had been elected to South Shields Town Council in November 1869 and was made an alderman in 1877. John passed away at the age of 76 in 1894. John Redhead and Son became a limited company in 1909. This brass plaque dates from this period. The partners were the four sons of the founder, Robert, John, James and William Bell Redhead. The Great Depression of the 1930s sounded the death knell for many shipbuilding yards. Between 1931 and 1937, only one new ship was built at Redheads. R. Wake wrote this letter in March 1931 to his friend Jack Layton he had known at Redheads. The letter begins, "Many apologies for not answering your last letter, but with being out of work and sick of walking the streets, one gets downhearted, John, and really you can't bear to look to yourself in a looking-glass." The author continues, "Well, John, things are really desperate up here. There is no one working at Redheads. All walking the streets, and it will be months before we get to start again. There is over 14,000 signing at the Labour Exchange now, and still increasing." The merchant cargo ship depicted on this beautifully carved wooden plaque is of a type prevalent from the 1890s onwards. The presence of the radio aerial may point to a date around the First World War period. The plaque was rescued by plumber foreman Joseph Harding Jr. when Redhead shipyard closed in 1977. This is one of my favourite exhibits and demonstrates South Tyneside's craftsmanship at its best. Redhead's landing was at cost-defying town South Shields, just off Commercial Road. In 2013 there was a campaign to save Redhead's Landing as the last publicly accessible river landing in South Shields. The campaign was not successful. In 1887 the Mercantile Dry Dock Company was formed. The director's report for 1893 described a period of financial panics, quarantine troubles, revolutions and strikes. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the Mercantile was one of the very few firms to continuously provide work in Jarrow. The yard closed in 1981. The location of the former yard is today home to the Cemex Jarrow Aggregates Wharf. Palmer's was established in 1851, and the last ship was built in 1933. Palmer's built 863 ships. Charles Mark Palmer was born in South Shields in 1822. The development of Jarrow from a small mining community into a major Tyneside centre of industry and commerce was in large part due to Palmer's yard. His name was synonymous with Jarrow. Palmer's was hit hard by the Great Depression, and the complete closure of the yard in 1933 had a devastating impact on Jarrow, as the firm had been the town's principal employer. At one time, approximately 10,000 men and boys were employed at Palmer's. The yard was acquired by the National Shipbuilders Security Limited, and the terms of the sale meant that shipbuilding in Jarrow was banned for the next 40 years. A staggering 70% of the local workforce found themselves unemployed in early 1933, resulting in bitter hardship and a desperate plea for work, culminating in the famous Jarrow Crusade of 1936. Truly the town that was murdered. Hawthorne Leslie's at Hebburn was established in 1853, with the last ship being built in 1982, with 764 ships being built in total. The most famous was the HMS Kelly. Between 1939 and 1945, the yard built 1 aircraft carrier, 3 cruisers, 2 fast mine layers, 16 flotilla leaders and destroyers, 19 other naval ships and 17 ships for the Merchant Navy. The last ship launched from what had been Hawthorne Leslie's was in 1982. Today, A&P Tyne continues to provide world-class ship repair in South Tyneside, including conversion and fabrication services for the marine and energy sectors, including some of the Sir David Attenborough Polar Explorer vessel, which was famously almost christened Boaty McBoatface in a public vote. It is the last of the large ship repair yards in South Tyneside. So what trades did you mainly work with, Peter, in the shipyards?
In 1971, when I first went into a shipyard, Redheads and South Shields, it would basically be burners, caulkers, fitters, blacksmiths, platers, shipwrights, plumbers. They would be the major trades. He has an apprentice burner. Now his duties would be to learn his trade. He might be doing 4 or 5 years depending what the period he was doing his training in. This tradesman is caulking a wooden deck with oakum, and basically he's using a caulking chisel for beating oakum in and a caulking hammer. Once the oakum was hammered in between the planks, maybe make them more uptight, or maybe just for to keep the weather out, it would be covered with some tar, and this would be allowed to sort of set, and the deck would be sort of finished off by maybe a quick sand if it was a bit high in places with the tar. Now this is a riveting squad scene where you've got the man on the deck. He's a rivet cooker and he's passing glowing red hot rivets to the young lad who would be the catcher. His duty would be to grasp the rivet and a pair of small tongs, put it to a hole that the riveters want to bash the rivet into. A guy would be underneath to hold the rivet in place, and 2 riveters would be engaged on flattening the protruding side out. You'd have a sealed rivet in a tight joint. A friend of mine, Stan, when he was a young boy out of the office, his job was catching the rivets in a tin bucket with a small pair of tongs to put it in the holes when it was ready. And then the rivet came down towards him and disappeared, and he was looking in his bucket, it wasn't there, and suddenly he felt a hot sort of sensation in his coat pocket, and his coat burst into flames, and he had to grab the rivet and obviously put it in the hole after all and beat himself out at the same time. Quite a comical scene, you would think, if you seen it happen in real life. This guy is basically finishing off, flattening off a rivet. There'll be a guy underneath who's basically holding the rivet in place, so the 2 men working in unison and rivet together. The guy only needs the rivet gun to do the job, because normally there would be 2 riveters with hammers carrying out the same duty. Now this is a scene of a guy, obviously arc welding, I'm assuming. He's got his personal protective equipment on, like his screen to protect his face from spark and the arc, which is sort of quite damaging to one's skin. He's got his apron and his gauntlets on, obviously his boiler suit to protect his body from all the hot sparks, and basically he looks as if he might be welding a fillet weld, or or a butt weld. This is a scene of a squad of shipwrights laying a wooden deck. The deck is made of steel. It's got a coating of sort of some sticky substance, which could be glue, tar, whatever. They lay the boards down. The boards would be laid on studs. The studs going through pre-drilled holes. The guy would tighten the bolts and nuts into place to hold the boards down, and as the scene early on, a guy would be coming along with an oakum and his caulking hammer and beating oakum into the joints till basically all the joints were sealed with oakum. Then a guy would ladle hot tar between the joints for weatherproofing. In this depiction, you've got a pair of burner's goggles, which would have coloured glass in and protective glass over the top, and would be elastic to hold them on the burner's head. There's also a gas spanner for putting on and taking off oxygen and propane gauges, and switching it on, and a selection of cleaning tips for to clean a nozzle out of a, say, a blowpipe or a welding torch. In this picture there's a pneumatic caulking hammer, which you've got the trigger where the arrow is pointing. The nozzle on the end is where you attach it to the pipe for the compressed air. You've got two chisels, which could be used for either chipping high spots of steel off or caulking an edge of some plate to make it watertight. In this depiction you have a shoe-shaped tar pouring device, and basically once the caulker, i.e. shipwright, had caulked the oakum between the two planks, that was possibly a deck plank, this thing would be used to pour a small quantity of tar along the edge before to make it watertight. This is a collection of shipwright's tools, the long tool being an adze, the smaller hammer being a caulking hammer, and a selection of caulking hammers for hammering oakum between two planks when they were either on a deck or in the old days when it might have been a ship's hull that needed caulking with oakum and pitch to seal a joint. This is a blacksmith's forge, as you can see at the back, where the blacksmith would heat his metal to a glowing red, and it would be positioned on the anvil, which is in the foreground, and he would hold it in a pair of tongs, and his blacksmith's help arm might hit it with a hammer, and the blacksmith would use certain tools to form and shape whichever shape he wanted, and he's also got the hooks on the end to shape, say, rings or hooks or whatever he was making at the time. This is a collection of blacksmith's tongs and shaping formers, which would use to make specialised shapes. This selection of rigger's tools. You've got a sharpening stone, knife, and a spike, some tallow, and some shaping tools for opening up the rope, so you can form the loop on the end of a rope for that's putting over bollards and for rigging duties, etc. This depiction is a pair of catcher's tongs and a rivet. Here is a collection of tracer's equipment, i.e. pens and compasses, a rule, chalks, watercolours. Basically, when the man needed to transfer some information and shapes to a drawing, he would use these tools. In this picture you have some draftsman's tools, i.e. set square, compasses, a rule, and some shapes for getting, say, keel shapes or whatever, frame shapes. During my apprenticeship I spent a short time learning to do draftsman's work, but obviously I wasn't qualified as a draftsman, but it was a good insight into the type of discipline the draftsman did. Here you will see displayed a typical old Victorian time clock, but obviously would work very much the same as a modern clock, i.e. set a 7:30 start time, and basically this one would register your numbers as you put in. This is a typical clocking in card with the start times and finishing times and dinner times if you went out the yard. This would be put in maybe a hand punch clock or electric clock, which would stamp it as you pushed in the slot at the top, recording your time leaving or entering the yard. You generally start at 7:30 in the morning and basically work till 12:30 lunchtime, and maybe come back 1:30 after an hour's lunch in the 1970s. Basically you would get a 10-minute tea break in the afternoon, and basically you would finish at 4:30, and then you would punch your card to go home. Here is a couple of typical 1980s ID cards. Basically, if you didn't have these cards, you mightn't get access through the security at the main gates. This is old style trilby, where a manager or somebody in a higher position would wear, possibly coming to work, might be even on the shop floor. But in my time in the 1970s, I never seen any headgear worn like this by management on the shop floor. They would generally wear a white hard hat that would show how important they were. It's a bowler hat. These would be worn sometime maybe in the 1950s, not in my time in the 1970s. And basically this would depict any man that was a foreman of the trades. Anybody that wanted to show authority would be wearing a bowler hat. As you can see, typical flat cap from any period between 1900 and probably 2020. But these were all worn right up to the 1990s, before the government put legislation in place that says everybody had to wear a hard hat for protection of one's head. This is a typical orange hard hat, and basically which trade it belonged to would depend which company you worked for and what discipline. But this was the norm from the 1990s, and basically if you didn't wear your hard hat on the shop floor or while working, if you were one of the other tradesmen, welders were exempt while wearing welding screens. You would get a taking off from the man in charge, I'm sure. Typical boiler suit, tie dock engineering. Basically every shop floor worker would be wearing a boiler suit for, you know, keep the oil, grease, paint, and if he was a burner, welder, plater, hot sparks, and you name it, off his person. Because at the end of the day, you don't want your going home clothes all full of holes, you know, if you can get a boiler suit given by the company. Depicted as a tea can, which was used right up to the day I started serving my time, but vacuum flasks become much more prevalent, so they were the option after this period. But it wasn't unusual to see older tradesmen with their cans on a gas heated sort of stove, where they would be brewing that tea for the morning break, 9 o'clock, brewing tea for lunchtime, or brewing tea for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you know. But they were still used in the 1970s, but like vacuum flasks took over that role. Time out at dinner time, you might want to play a game of 3-card brag or something, so somebody always had a packet of greasy shiny cards to while away the hours at lunchtime, while playing for pennies and tuppences and maybe 5 pences. 5s and 3s was also a popular domino game which people would undertake during lunchtime, you know. Always remember the term "I'm knocking." Here's the bait cabin, not typical because we are worked on the shipbuilding berth in Redheads. We had to find a cubby hole, but if you were one of the workers that had to go off at tea time to replenish your stock of tools or brackets or get spare parts, you would be retired to your bait cabin at, say, for your 9 o'clock break in the morning. You might be joining off to here at 1 o'clock, or, you know, this is an off the ship sort of bait cabin. Seen from Redhead shipyards, where everybody's leaving for their lunch at 12:30 off to the canteen across the road. As you can see, they're still all dressed in their boiler suits, so it's not home time yet. Leisure time after work, this looks like down the pub, or we sometimes used to go to the pub at lunchtime, 12 o'clock, and stay for a 40-minute sort of break and a couple of pints of reasonably weak beer, maybe get a pie over the counter. And my favourite pub was the Commercial. Also there was a Neptune Hotel over the road. These were both in Costafine town, just across the road from Redhead Shipyard. Everybody likes a pint of beer, but as it depicted, rivet catcher is an old trade in the yards, isn't it? Catching rivets and off the heater up and passing them on to the riveters. So enjoy it when you can get yourself a bottle. Going back to the blueprint you have on display, basically this would be a ship built in, say, the 1920s or 30s in an old way where they would build it out of individual plates, i.e. they would have laid it a steel keel and then they would have put frames in, and the plates would have been attached to the frames and the keel, and the ship would have been completed from the centre line to the forward and the aft. In my day, in the 1970s, ships would have been prefabricated in a sub-assembly shop by platers. All the parts would have been into a box section. All the welding would have been completed in the sub-assembly shop and then put on a low loader and brought over to the building ways. Now the building ways would have been on a set of blocks forward or aft, and basically the keel would have been laid probably in wider sections because it's a prefabricated ship. Then you would have the crane depositing finished units onto the keel, and the platers and shipwrights would have been fabricating and joining the unit up to the shell and other units when they were added. So you would have like a box section added to the front, box section added to the back, and basically you would have like maybe 7 or 8 on the port side and then 7 or 8 units on the starboard side, and then eventually the forepeak and the stern would be added to the ship, hence, and everything would have been fabricated and welded eventually. So what you ended up at the end of the exercise was a basically box that was the ship's hull, all watertight and ready for any launch that would be taking place in the future. I was at possibly 3 ship launches in Redhead Shipyard when I was there between 71 and 75 as an apprentice welder. You'd get the dignitaries turned up in their big cars if they were royalty, and if they were sort of lesser royalty, you know, whatever sort of transport they turned up in, they would obviously make their way to the launch platform, which was in front of the ship. The lady would give the ship a name when she was carrying out the launch ceremony, i.e. Dalkeith, something like that. This bottle of champagne would be swung, smashed on the bow of the ship, and she would give good grace to everybody that was sailing in that ship, you know, that they have happy voyages. The shipwrights, after hearing the bottle of champagne crash, would be given orders from the man in charge, the foreman, to knock the locking bars out so the ship could slide down the launch ways and into the water, and the drag chains would be rattling and slowing down the ship as it entered the water, and so the ship didn't have a habit of crashing into anything, i.e. maybe the other bank, or you know, and then tugs would come in attendance, ropes would be thrown overboard, the tugs would guide the new launch ship back to the quayside, and the ship would be tied up. The dignitaries would obviously go for their refreshments and chat how well the launch went, and everybody would be happy for the launch day. Yeah, and we, if we'd sort of finished our shift, we'd just be away home early, hopefully, but not necessarily. Good time had by all. During the 1940s, women were working in the shipyards as a wartime expedient, i.e. you would get rivet catchers and lady welders, but in my time, when I started my apprenticeship in the 1970s, there was no ladies on the tools as welders or riveters or anything along them lines, except maybe domestic cleaners on the ship. my experience of the shipyards in the 1970s, 80s, 90s was always men working. In 1994, I had an opportunity to work in Holland for a year, and on a shipbuilding project in a Dutch shipyard, there was lady welders doing the same job as the men. It wasn't until 2021 that I came across the first lady welders in the UK, in AP Tyne apprentice welders, and in close engineering apprentice welder, lady welder. The working environment was dangerous, whichever part of the shipyard was in. You know, there was always a danger of being aware that there might have been a burner working above you, so if you're seeing sparks coming down onto the scaffold, make yourself scarce. If the caulker was cutting a seam, there might be bits of metal chippings flying along the scaffold, you'd make yourself scarce, you know. It wasn't until the 1990s where compulsory PPE became the mandatory sort of necessity, i.e. hard hats, boiler suits, safety boots, glasses and maybe gloves. Up to that point it was bring your own PPE. Normally these guys just expired with a heart attack through overwork and too many long hours from the days when piecework was a factor in the 1950s and 60s. Industrial diseases weren't really noticed amongst the workforce. There was always some fellow worker coughing and spluttering, but you just put that down to sort of general sort of ill health, you know. It wasn't until later in the 1970s and 80s that you got a good ground, and these the things that could be affecting your lungs, your hearing. You know, they were a little bit blasé and a little bit blind to the factors of things that could cause you sort of industrial damage. I joined the Boilermakers Union in 1973 when I'd been an apprentice for about 2 years. An old welder, Jack Fenton, he was like a branch secretary, assistant, whatever, and he invited us to go along and join the trade union as the junior members. We would qualify as tradesmen when we turned 20. This guaranteed us like protection from persecution within the working environment, and also give us an opportunity to have our say on issues of health and safety. You know, say you needed ear plugs, ear defenders, glasses, something like that, you could go and see the foreman. He would send you to the ambulance room, who might not want to give you the PPE, and you always had the fallback of going to see your union representative, your shop steward in the shipyard, and he could actually smooth the way and make sure you got what your requirements were. 40 years later, I went to work in an engineering shop, and here presto, no ventilation except a couple of portable units on the shop floor, which weren't very effective, and basically 20 welders all blazing away making fumes, and on asking where the spare ventilation was told, well, if you don't like the working conditions, do you know where the door is? You can go. But this place was non-Boilermaker sort of affiliated. Demarcation would have segregated all them trades from doing anybody else's trades, you know. So I mean, in my working career of 50 years, I probably had anything up to 60 jobs, sometimes lasting a week, sometimes a month, sometimes 6 months, and when I was really lucky, maybe a year or more. But it wasn't unusual to see somebody try to muscle in and try to take your job, and they'd have to be reminded that they weren't either coded or skilled enough to do your job, and to leave it alone. During the 1980s, one shipyard or one dockyard was closing one month, one the next, till at the end of the day you had very little shipbuilding or ship repair capacity. It was like a creeping barrage, you could say. One, you know, employment was disappearing on the River Tyne and River Wear. So during the 1980s, I travelled south.
Do you see any possible future for the shipbuilding industry?
It would be nice to have a go at recreating a small shipbuilding sort of industry, because after all, if you see the transportation of the amount of goods from the south coast to the north via 40-ton wagons, you could envisage the possibility of sending all that freight by sea. Small container ships, which they use like on the Rhine and the Danube. What's to stop the British sort of maritime industry not having similar sort of ships, or even sort of modern ones powered by wind in some shape or form, wind electric, just to try help this global warming problem that we seem to have been engulfed with.